All right, well, why don't we go ahead and let's get started. So I'm gonna kind of go a little bit weird today. I was thinking as we were putting this together, the goal is to kind of talk to like how do you create a very modern grant making program. I'm gonna kind of come back to that because I want to start with a quick introduction of who I am at Reviewer and kind of what we do because I think it helps kind of tell a story and come full circle with why we came up with today's topic. But I started to kind of bullet and think through like what does a modern grant making process or program look like? And I thought of a whole kind of slew of ideas, and then I kind of realized that's a combination of all of them. And so instead of maybe going through like a full presentation with a bunch of bullet points and text, like why don't I just show you guys, obviously within Reviewer, what that would actually look like. So the goal today isn't to actually preview it and get a deep dive into our platform. It's more so like how do you just visualize some of these concepts and some of these thoughts. That way you can kind of take them and apply them to your programs. Obviously, if it's powered by Reviewer, that's great. But I think I'm more of a visual person, so instead of me kind of running through a bunch of text and PowerPoint spreadsheets, etc., let's just take a look at Reviewer. So with all that said, I'm going to start with a really quick introduction of not just who I am, but what we do here at Reviewer, but kind of how we came up with this topic, because I think it's kind of a long overdue topic, and it's a culmination of probably the last 3 months of webinars that we've hosted. So a couple quick housekeeping items, or I guess one quick housekeeping item. There is built-in chat, obviously, within Zoom. If you guys have any comments, thoughts, or feedback or elements that you want to kind of incorporate, please do toss them into the chat. Either we can address them as we go, we can kind of sidetrack and we kind of go off on some tangents, or we can save them for the end for an open Q&A. I want to make sure that I'm, providing you guys as much value as possible. So with all that said, my name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewer. Been doing this now for over a decade. And I think what makes us a very unique type of organization and why many of our clients have found so much success is that we kind of lived the life, we've walked life in your shoes. So we started the company initially as a volunteer, as part of a review committee, obviously very heavily involved with investments and funding opportunities. So grant making is obviously a core foundation of that. And back at that point of time, and I don't mean to offend anybody on this call, it was very paper manual based processes. So literally as a volunteer, we had hundreds and sometimes hundreds and hundreds of binders being mailed to our doorsteps. And we were asked with, handwriting notes and feedback and filling out like score sheets, and then either physically mailing it back to the grant making organizations, or we meet in person with other committee members and we'd hash out the details until we had kind of our final selections. From there, the grant makers would kind of go off and do their own thing. As far as, collecting grant reporting templates, we don't know how that was happening. It was obviously very manual. Obviously, as you can imagine, as a volunteer, it was overwhelming to say the least. But the problem was kind of fast forwarding probably 3 or 4 years. And that was kind of this onslaught of technology. So you start to see a wide variety of organizations say, hey, we want to quote unquote modernize our program. We want to create efficiency. So let's use forms. Let's use our websites. Let's use our association management softwares. Let's use grant making tools. Let's use spreadsheets. Let's use emails. Let's download documents. And while each of those in its core elements is obviously an online tool, none of which were intended for the task at hand. And so while it created some efficiencies, it actually posed pretty significant threats and challenges down the road. So two kind of things started popping up for us that we've heard and seen over the years. Number one is that there were use cases where applicants would apply and submit their content and their deliverables through email with a bunch of attachments that either A will go to a spam filter, or B, as they're being downloaded and exported and recompiled, things would get lost. And so when review teams would sit down and go through actual selections and grant funds, they found out months later that not even all of the applicants got included in the review. So, as a mission-driven organization, like that just physically can't happen. That's quite problematic. It's also a compliance issue. We also started to see, at least in close-knit communities, that other kind of committee members and evaluators knew who the applicants were. And so, with the lack of like redaction of data, they're making very clear personal biases into their selection process. So, this is ultimately what led us to build Reviewer. Again, I know it's a long story, but what makes us kind of unique is that we built it selfishly for ourselves to make the review process both more efficient and fair. But then in that journey, working with thousands and thousands of organizations, kind of keep an ear on the ground and a pulse of like the emerging trends and common use cases. And it's really a built by the people for the people type of tool set. So I told you there's a reason why I wanted to give the introduction first. one of the things that keeps continuing to pop up over and over is when we talk with these thousands and thousands of organizations every year, it's always like, how do we create a more modern program? We're ready to step into the 21st century, which I know we're deep into that already. Very much post-COVID, we have these organizations that said, look, historically we've been very manual, paper-based, or using kind of tools. We're now ready to make that leap into technology. We want to modernize it. So that term came up so many times that we kind of want to create this topic around like, what are the core elements that should be incorporated to a modern grant making program? Not necessarily how do you modernize it, but like what does a 2025 style grant look like? How do we create an ecosystem for success for applicants? How do we provide them the tools that they're very much expecting to be using at this point in time? How do we help you and your teams obviously create efficiencies in operations? How do we protect you from a compliance perspective? And I think the often overlooked segment here is how do we create efficiencies as well as an ecosystem for the review committees to create very fair, non-biased selections. And that's what I want to talk about here today. So some of the things we're going to talk through is like, what does a very common application structure look like? I think there's three things that kind of go into that makes us, again, kind of unique and different. One is qualification of candidates. Number two is potentially references. I am going to toss a quick note here in the chat of who is collecting references or letters for applicants, just out of curiosity to see how common that is. That's a very deep process here with our scholarship making clients, but it is permeating into grants. And then ongoing data collection from the grantee. So grant reporting templates, all that kind of fun stuff. From there, we're going to kind of transition into the review and selection side of things, right? So how do you kind of create these review buckets and workflows that are being very kind of fair to the review staff's time and also kind of using tools to actually conduct selection processes. And then kind of a little bonus there is how do you leverage both AI for some of these elements, and then also how do we start to identify potential evaluators or judges on your team that might be have different kind of judging tendencies than others, aka are they more strict or easier judges? So with all that said, let's kind of jump into kind of the core framework for today, and then we are going to kind of bounce around here a little bit, looking at some of the other components. So number one is the submission experience itself. You'll see that I use the term experience quite a bit as I kind of talk about reviewer, and that's really what it's all about, right? We have to create really three of them: an applicant experience, an operational experience, and then a review and selection experience. And if you think through like a very common grant structure, like there are so many moving parts, and it doesn't really matter the type of organization you are. And you could be doing other opportunities besides grant making. It could be scholarships, fellowships, board nominations, you name it. You are collecting data from an applicant, and that consists of who they are. It consists of submission forms, and I say forms plural because on the front end, you might be collecting like their actual application, but it might be a multi-phase program where you want them to come back and submit additional deliverables or unlock additional deliverables as they go through their life cycle. If they're a grantee that gets selected, we work with some American Rescue Plan organizations, so cities and communities across the country who literally once a month for 4.5 years have to come back into the system to submit additional grant reporting templates, right? So when I say submissions, I really do mean it's not just the front-facing one-off online application, but then long-term, any ongoing data collection you have from them. On top of that, you're going to get into things like file uploads. There's going to be some type of judging and scoring process, some type of note taking that goes on. So how do we kind of create this centralized hub that takes all those components and centralizes them? And we have to think through kind of two kind of things, right? So number one is at some point in time, you're going to review these applications. That inherently means that you have to collect data, right, to make a very informed, non-biased selection. But at the same time, like what is the bare minimum information that you need to collect at that point in time? And then lower the barrier for the applicants, because at the end of the day, these are life-changing opportunities for them. They are applying for funding for some purpose, right? And so how do you lower the barrier for them so they can be hyper-focused on creating the best version of their forms and less so getting concerned about how do I convert this PDF into an email to send it to you, or is my information going to get lost, so on and so forth. So let's kind of take a look at some of those items. I want to kind of walk you through, again, a very common application structure in Reviewer. There's also other kind of components here, and I am going to kind of convert some of these slides into, so to answer this question, into multiple talking points, but also we will follow up with both the slides, a blog post, tours, videos, you name it. So we got you covered. The other thing I want to talk about here too is data security and privacy. It's a very non-sexy thing to talk about, but it's also absolutely critical. Again, these are life-changing opportunities that need to be treated as such. And so, anytime you're dealing with financial information or your funding opportunities, you have personal identifying information. We have to be hypersensitive to not just how we're collecting it, but also how we're distributing it. So, for example, you'd be shocked at the number of organizations that I see collect tax documents through email, through things like JotForm, and then to get it into the hands of the review team, they have to export it, download it, and email back to them. They put them on like Google Drive, they put them into spreadsheets. You have review committee members storing it on their local hard drives. These are things that are often overlooked, but they're absolutely paramount to the success of these campaigns. Also, from an applicant's perspective, we do need to build trust and confidence with them as well. So, I want to make sure that we just at a high level address that reviewers got you covered. But if you're not using a reviewer, just kind of think through like the different tools that you're using, the compliance aspects, and what certifications do they have, and then kind of lastly, do they all kind of play well with one another? So jumping into reviewer, I'm going to walk you through again a very common grant application. I talked about just a little bit ago all the moving parts to really the grant process in general, right? From the submissions all the way to the post grantee reporting and templates. The only way that you can make this a reality, and I really would argue and say that you can't have a modern program without a profile structure, right? We have to have a very dedicated hub that has all the components that go into these. So in Reviewer, the grantees or the applicants very quickly and easily create a profile. And it seems like a small thing because it is, right? They just tell us who they are. But long term, that profile will literally hold on to all the content, all the deliverables, all the activities that correspond with them. So A, it's a way for you to kind of collect information, store it, make it accessible. But then B, it also kind of centralizes the process for A, the review committee, as also the applicants themselves. So again, as we approach here, it's hard to believe 2025. I think most applicants and most individuals in general are used to having accounts, are used to having dedicated hubs for the task at hand. I will go on the record and say they do not want to go to the website. They do not want to download an Adobe PDF form that they have to then convert into Acrobat, email it back to you with a bunch of attachments, and then go to Google Drive and submit more file uploads, and then send more stuff back to you through email, right? They want to have a centralized hub. So that's first and foremost. Number two is I want to make sure that we are being sensitive to everyone's time, not just the applicants, but also yours. So if you are a grant maker that has very, very, very clear and specific kind of criteria or requirements or eligibility, let's bake that into the process. So in this example, we actually have a client of ours, and we redacted and we kind of changed some of the verbiage here, that actually uses a grant recommendation tool. So it does two things. Number one is it'll ask the applicant a series of questions. And based on what they answer, it'll say, yeah, you can proceed on or you can't, right? It seems like a small thing, but we don't want to waste somebody's hard-earned time and energy applying for an opportunity that they just physically are not eligible for. And then conversely, from your team's perspective, I don't want you to have to spend a bunch of time vetting and reviewing applications that really aren't qualified to begin with. Number two is you might offer multiple different types of grants, or applicants may not even be aware of the opportunities that they're even eligible for. So in that example, you could have applicants come in, answer a series of questions. Again, this is kind of some redacted, changed content here. I've seen some that are 40, 50, 60 questions long. I've seen some that are 3. And then based on these answers, reviewer would say, hey, based off of what you just submitted, these are the 3 grant opportunities that you best align with. Please select whichever all of them you want to apply for. From there, we're going to create a personalized experience. So again, this is all why I couldn't create a modern webinar topic like that without kind of walking you through the whole workflow, because there's so many moving pieces that make it modern in conjunction with one another. Because it seems like a small thing, but what if you have completely separate application forms or deliverables for one grant opposed to another? With this workflow, the system will recognize their choice, and then all the subsequent pages are going to be hyper specific, only asking questions relevant to that grant. And then on the back end, you might have different dates and deadlines, different committee members, different scoring criteria. We're actually setting the stage now to make that all very realistic. Now, as far as a grant application itself goes, again, it's going to be very unique to the content that you want to collect from your grantees, right? You have a mission, you've got a vision, you're funding organizations that align with why you exist. So your application forms have to obviously be structured in that way. For me, when I structure a grant application, I want to try to tie it back to impact, right? At some point in time, we have to go back to our boards and go back to our community and say, hey, with these funds, this is the impact that we had on our mission, vision, and our communities. And so you have to make sure that the data being collected, A, on the front end, as well as B, on the back end with grant reporting templates kind of match one another. So we'll kind of come back a bit more to that here in just a little bit. But in this example, it's an organizational-wide grant. Again, this is going to be obviously just one example. So we want to know more about who they are. We want to know more about the amounts that are being requested. We want to know more about, I guess, the project title and the summary of it. So this is, again, going to go back to grant reporting templates. We're asking them to tell us more about, tell us more about your project. How does it align with your mission? Tell us more about your budgets. What is your funding need, right? Like, how are those funds actually going to be utilized? And then one of some of my favorite questions, like, how are you going to define success? So at some point in time, you're going to report back to us, right? Impact that you've had. So how are you going to hold yourself accountable? Because that's how we're going to have you report back to us. And then lastly, like, how sustainable is this long term? Is this a one and done grant? Or are you going to have to apply for additional funding in 3 years, right? We just want to get a better feel for the ecosystem. This is a very, I think, short grant application, generally speaking, compared to many that I do see, but it really does cover on the front end everything you need. Again, how much do you need? What do you need it for? How are you going to use the funds? Tell us more about your financial literacy with budgets, and then how are you going to measure success, right? That's it. That's all we need. Now, you might want more content from this grantee in the future. That's totally fine. The power of a platform and a modern tool like Reviewer is that you can actually have the applicants come back, answer questions, add more content to it, but you may not need that from everybody. So again, on the front end, what's the core basic that you need now? And then, yeah, you can get more specifics from those later on as you kind of narrow it down, like the top 10, top 20, whatever that looks like for you. So I do love breaking these applications into multi-steps. The next thing that we're going to kind of look at here are deliverables. So again, within Reviewer, we kind of pride ourselves on file uploads. We understand that you can tell us stories through text, but tell us more about, tax documents, financial planning, project plans, etc. So we can take in an infinite number for the most part of file uploads in Reviewer. I'm going to show this to you down the road. Just because you can take in a file doesn't really mean anything, right? I could send you an email with an attachment. I could go to Google Drive, upload a file, and send you a link. What makes this powerful and why this is important to talk about is how do you gain access to that file? So again, in Reviewer, it's all profile centric. So these files are actually being dropped right into the applicant's profile. And then when you and your team come in or the review committees come in, not only are they viewing the applicant's content itself, but they can physically view those files in our app, videos, photos, PowerPoint, spreadsheets, you name it. They don't have to download them, go use other tools, come back later. So again, I'll save that for a little bit to show you. Just kind of keep that in mind. And then references. So nobody really kind of reacted to that comment. So I'm going to skip that. Again, if you guys want me to come back to this at the end of the conversation, I totally will. We do have some pretty cool tools though that will actually notify the applicant, the person that's writing a reference, and then they will then join the profile, add their reference, and then they can kind of submit it later on. We also are very anti-reference letters here at Reviewer. We love reference templates, but again, I'm going to leave it at that. Nobody obviously is doing that, so I'm not going to talk about it. If you want to revisit this though, please do leave a comment in the chat, and we can also save it for the end. Okay, so that kind of wraps up, I think, the application side of things. E-signatures, all those things are absolutely critical. I do want to kind of come back though, and I'm going to pull a separate example here in just a second of grant reporting. So what's going to end up happening here is in Reviewer, I mentioned beforehand that I think through these profiles as submissions, plural, because again, we have an applicant that just submitted. Now what happens if they got selected and we need more data from them? We unlock additional deliverables for round 2, or they're now 3 years in the future and they're doing post-grant reporting templates on their impact and sustainability of the project. So again, this is really where the magic happens within our platform. This is the profiles. So I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but we have Michael. Michael is a grantee at this point, right? And we're reviewing Michael's application. So you can see here on the center of my page, all of this content that we're looking at is exactly what we just collected in that form, right? There's the budgets, there's the summaries. If I keep scrolling down here, how does it align with our mission? Here's your budget upload. How are you going to measure success, right? And then within here, they talked about exactly how they're going to different metrics and targets, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump up to the top And I think it's critical to have a modern program is to not use multiple tools. I've already alluded to that numerous times, and that starts with communication, right? You have very specific communication that you want to have with these grantees or applicants or committee members. We want to make sure that we're logging these notes in a system of centralized hub. So what I can actually do is I can one-to-one send direct messages to my applicants. This is nice because A, it ensures deliverability. It'll send a notification email to them, but if that ever got blocked or if they didn't get it, they at any point can come back into reviewer. You can call them, you can send them smoke signals, but when they come into the system, that message lives on. It's also critical from a perspective of sharing confidential data. We don't want you communicating with your applicants very private, secure conversations through email. It's just not what it's intended for. So using our secure portal, you can log those notes and then they would come in and they can view it. It also allows you internally leave notes and comments, etc. Where I'm kind of going with this though is the data collection. So I mentioned beforehand the numerous different types of file uploads. You can kind of see that we went back to our roots in 2010 and we took those heavy physical binders that we didn't love and we tried to virtualize it. There is still value behind that ideology of having a centralized binder for your grantees. The problem is that we don't want to have a physical binder. So you have a section called attachments, and within here, it'll literally show us every single file that was ever uploaded, not just on the application, but also long-term any additional content being added. Better yet, if I press the view button, it actually shows me the content of it. Now, again, this is for demo purposes only. This is a very, very simple document, but it does show you that I can view a full-blown spreadsheet or a budget within here. It could be photos, it could be videos, it could be PowerPoints, it could be PDFs. All of those are supported. So I never have to physically leave a reviewer to access this content. Now, it's also beneficial in the sense that I can prevent people from downloading it. Now, what I will go on the record by saying is I can't prevent them from grabbing their cell phone and taking a photo, right? Like we just can't stop that from happening. However, we can make it a bit more challenging for people to take private, secure data and store it locally. You can also pick and choose elements within the profile that get shared out. So again, I'm long-winded as I talk through this because again, when I talk about like a modern grant making process, it isn't just saying do this and you're modern, right? Otherwise, I would say just go use a software. There's so many moving parts that in conjunction with one another make these programs a great success. Okay, so the last thing that I want to show you on this section here is ongoing data collection. Because again, the worst thing that I can possibly see happen, maybe not the worst, but one of the worst, is using a tool like Reviewer for part of the process, right? The grant applications, even the judging and scoring process. And then 6 months from now, you ask, in this case, Michael to come back and send you a personal email with his grant reporting template that at that point goes to spam or gets lost or disconnected, right? So we want to make sure that we think through these programs as a life cycle and that they have to be powered by the same tool set from end to end. So in this example, Michael might come back in 5 days, 5 years, whatever it looks like. And we want him to submit a grant reporting template. He just simply clicks add new and then picks from a predefined list what deliverables you want from him. Because you might have 9 different things that you ultimately need from your grantees. They would pick from that list of 9 what it is that they're submitting. In this example, Michael says grant reporting template, and then it drops the applicant right into the template itself. So the applicant will fill this out. Now, again, there's thoughts and logic behind this, right? It's mapped directly to the form. So we want to know, again, what was the initial amount requested? What were your dates? What was your initial goal of the grant application versus the actual outcome? Tell us more about discrepancies between the two of them. You told us as a grantee how you were going to measure success based off of certain metrics. What were those metrics? What were the targets actual versus, again, the discrepancies between them? What was your impact that you had with the grant funding? Tell us more about the actual utilization of funds. Like, did you use all of it? Do you still need more? What went well? What didn't go well? And then kind of what's next, right? It's like, what are the lessons learned and how are you going to kind of adapt for future milestones, right? So as soon as this gets submitted, all of this content actually goes directly back to the applicant's profile. So when you press view, you'll see that you can embed the entire grant reporting template right smack dab on the applicant's profile. So again, long-winded, but full circle is why I was going to show this to you, is I've got a grantee that now has their submission form, their file uploads, communication, judging and selection processes, and then all the ongoing data collection that they're ever going to need between you and them. So really powerful stuff here. This at its core is what makes a program modern. So kind of the bonus elements then from here on out is going to be conducting reviews. So if I kind of jump back here, I'm going to go right back into reviewer. I don't really want to read you guys a PowerPoint or a spreadsheet. But we have to kind of think through with your campaigns. Like you're obviously collecting grant applications either all up front or it might be a rolling review process. How do you take these applications as they come in and then distribute them out to your team for some type of review and selection process? That is a high level statement that's going to be different for absolutely everybody, largely impacted by your bandwidth and your capacity. So if you're an organization that gets 1,000 grant applications a year, you physically yourself can't review 1,000 applications, right? That's just not fair. With that said, if it's a multi-phase program, how are you going to, advance people along the way? Do you have different types of grants with each one having a different committee in charge of reviewing it? I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that because there are so many different ways I've seen these programs ran. But at its core, you got to take your applications and you've got to send them off to your review team for some type of judging, review, and selection process. So what does that look like? For me, there's two components. Number one is I want to first, if we can redact any information, like let's do that. So for example, like demographic details or PII, if it doesn't pertain to the review and selection itself, then like let's just not show it to them, right? Let's just better safe than sorry. Number two is I love randomization. And what I mean by that is if you have, 5 grant applications, okay, maybe that's not the best tool for you. But from some of the research that we've done, most volunteers physically cannot review more than 15 grant applications. It's a small number, but when they're reading through budgets and spreadsheets and looking at content, right? After 15, their energy levels drop off pretty tremendously. And so how do you then say, did that evaluator give the same energy to the first person versus the 31st person? And the answer, what we found is probably not. So how do you combat that? And you do so by figuring out what your threshold is and then ensuring that every applicant gets reviewed enough times, right, to get a fair, I guess, representation of their entry while being sensitive to people's time. The other kind of component to that is the actual quantitative measurements. Far too many times do I hear organizations say, yeah, we take in all these grant applications. I send them off to my committee. I don't know what they do. They just kind of talk about it for a few weeks and then they just tell me who they want to fund. So there might be a really robust rhyme and reason that's happening behind the scenes, but there has to be clear visibility on what's happening. We also want to create consistency, right? We want every single one of our volunteers or our committee members or our judges to have some type of structure around how they go through their selection process. That way we can kind of ensure that we're comparing apples to apples. So the only way to do that is to leverage score sheets. Now, I'm not telling you to leverage a score sheet to make grant funding decisions for you. What I am saying is to use some type of score sheet to put a mathematical value behind the applicant's name. And then from there, leverage that data to make your deliberation meetings and make informed decisions off of it. Now, do we have clients that use score sheets as the end all be all? 100%. But most of them will take the score sheets in combination with deliberation meetings and talk about why they score people the way that they did. So let's take a quick peek at those two components because again, that's the kind of the bread and butter here. So operationally speaking, I'm not going to talk about how to use Reviewer. Again, you can't physically call a grant making process as modern if you're living within folders and spreadsheets. So obviously we have a dedicated backend hub. It has all the things that you as a grant maker would need: dashboarding, viewing data, sending messages, email templates, workflows, you name it. But let's jump way ahead to two things, or really one thing, and that's the review and selection bucketing. So we have a feature in Reviewer called buckets, and it's the easiest way for me to describe this. So a bucket is basically a way for you to take a bunch of submissions or applicants, put them into a bucket, and fill up your bucket with a team of potential people to review it. What I mean by that is you might not have every evaluator or reviewer reviewing all the submissions. So for some of our clients that might offer like 4 or 5 different grants, they create one bucket per grant. Others will do that in combination of multiple phases. So phase 1 review is an internal team that vets it. Phase 2 review goes to like an executive committee or a board. Phase 3 might be an interview. And then phase 4 is all the ongoing data collection from the grantee themselves. Some of our clients will do monthly grants, right? So they have a bucket called January, February, March. There's a million ways to configure this, but I want to show you why this is super powerful. So again, if I choose the Lennox Wilder grant, this is the example we looked at in the form, I'm going to make an assumption that all of my applicants applied to the Lennox Wilder grant. The next thing we want to do is look at our review committee. So maybe that's a family foundation or a funded opportunity. So you might have, the Lennox Wilder family who are the review committee members, but they physically cannot see the Meredith Haley grant. Or you wanted to bifurcate this out to like a team of 5 people. So whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark log into Reviewer, they're physically only going to have access to the grant applications in the bucket that you gave them access to. So this works really, really well if you want to kind of pair up large groups of people with one another. You can assign people to as many buckets as you want. But once I open this up, it actually shows us what's going on. So it shows you a real-time list of all of the grantees or the applicants, as well as who potentially could review them. It also shows you how many times that they've been assigned to be reviewed and by who. So going back to like my personal preference, which is randomization, you can do this with one click. So you might want to say two things. One is I want to make sure that every one of my applicants gets reviewed about 5 times, maybe not less than 4, but not more than 6 or 7. At the same time, I don't want my committee to have to look at more than 20 people. So you can bulk select your grantees and then physically type in, give every applicant to 6 random evaluators. So the system will equally and randomly distribute that back out to your team. Now, if you wanted to override that and have complete manual control, you can simply click on the judge's name, and then you can pick and choose who you want to pair them up with. So again, we took like this concept of taking all of your applications and giving it to everybody. We then broke it down into the middle by saying, okay, maybe not. Maybe let's use randomization all the way down to the bottom of the funnel, which is like a very one-to-one pairing system. So you have hyper control over who can see what. Again, I would also, argue that I want this data to be redacted. So then the last piece of the puzzle is the review. I don't want you ever, hopefully, to ever have to send off to your review team a bunch of folders and links to Google Drive and ask them to have to download a bunch of material, figure out who they're looking at, go back to a spreadsheet to plug in their notes, and then send it back to you for you then to have to manually take that data and run a bunch of formulas off of it. I want the entire review and selection process done in one centralized hub. So your review team would simply come in and they're going to see a list, right, or a menu of all of the grantees that they're in charge of reviewing. From here, again, the data can be redacted, but they'll open up the grantee and they get this really powerful split screen. So half of their page is the grant application, quote unquote, the grant binder or profile. Again, if you want to redact any PII, you can. And then off to the right is your review and selection tool. Now, again, I mentioned earlier on that I love to use mathematic-based scorecards because it helps kind of build a structure or a leaderboard. You will see, however, here that there is no math. That's actually by design. A lot of times review committee members and judges get bogged down with numbers. And so if you say, hey, give on a scale of 1 to 20, rank this person's grant project or their funding needs or their success measurement, they're going to say, well, what's the difference between a 16 and a 17? And then you start to have some judges that just look at these applications through a completely different scope than one another. So instead, you can lower the barrier, make it super simple. Because again, these review committee members are probably going to be doing this at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. So try to elicit an emotional response. So again, like what is this application's alignment with our mission and vision? Below average or above average, right? You can still then have a point value behind the scenes, but it lowers the barrier for the review committee member. What we found is by trying to elicit an emotional response, you very quickly and easily get their judgment call, which is usually the right call. And then again, they can kind of fill this out. Now you will see at the bottom that there is still point value. So if I choose, above average, I might get 4 points. Again, we just don't need the judges to know that. So why this works super, super well and why this is probably about as modern as it gets is they can kind of side by side toggle back and forth between the application form. They can physically look at files embedded in Reviewer. They can leave notes. They can look at grant reporting templates. Again, they can look at the files and then they fill out their score sheet. Once they're done, in Reviewer in real time, we build out these leaderboards. So again, it shows you a list of every single grantee. It shows you the team that evaluated them, how they individually scored, how they collectively scored, what their averages were. And this is where if you wanted to, you could leverage in real time the data from high to low to make your decisions. Or this is often used in like a deliberation meeting to say, okay, the results are in, here's our top 15 or the top 10 or everybody. Let's kind of now talk about why we score people the way that we did. Just because, say, for example, if Leslie was the highest rated applicant, there might be a really compelling reason why Sheldon should be receiving funding, right? So our goal at Reviewer is to give you the data to make those informed decisions off of it. So the only last thing I want to kind of allude to here, again, this is just from our experience, is whenever you do a random distribution, so I can't sit here and say, hey, to be modern, you should randomly assign submissions to judges because I just presented a tremendous challenge. And that challenge is that every applicant gets reviewed by the same people. And you can kind of see it happening here, right? So I've got Mark. Mark scored Sheldon a 12. So then my question then would be, okay, did Mark just score Sheldon low? Or what if Mark has never given higher than like a 13? So by his own personal standards, he actually gave Sheldon a really, really, really good score. But in comparison to Judge Judy here, who gave it a 31, Sheldon's actually being penalized. So in Reviewer, again, I'm not going to get too deep into this today. We give you these really cool reports that will actually show you on a per applicant and per judge basis how they're scored on each question. What I wanted to show you though is this green section. And what this is doing is it's normalizing the results. So this is a real client of ours. All the data has been redacted. And they basically said, hey, why is it that every single year, whoever Judge Judy scores is always ranked lower than whoever Tony scores? Well, the data is pretty obvious. On average, Judge Judy scores about a 24, but Tony scores a 34. So literally, if you were an applicant assigned to Tony, you will always be scored almost 10 points, or in this case, like 20% more than Judge Judy. So that's, again, quite problematic. So now that we know that, we can use it to make informed decisions, but also we have, again, the reporting in place that will basically replace these results with averages. So if you got scored a 24, we don't really care. What that really means is that you were scored a 1, which means you were scored completely average. If you were scored higher than average, you're like a 1.1. If you're scored lower than average, you're like a 0.89. So then what you can do is in the report, it'll give you then every single judge's collective averages opposed to one another. And then the results are kind of goofy looking, but it basically would say, hey, Bruce is our highest rated applicant who on average scores about 1.15 times higher than average, whereas Elon is almost 0.83 lower than average. So with that said, those are the main things I want to talk about. I want to make sure I give you guys ample time for a bunch of questions. But I think, again, my goal today was to kind of talk through more holistically, like you can't sit back and try to run a modern program or even a grant the right way without thinking through the entire life cycle, and everything has to be kind of intertwined. Anything along the way that's using manual effort or spreadsheets or downloading of documents or has any type of subjective touch to it is going to throw kind of a wrench into the grand scheme of things. So again, just to continue to reiterate, I think it's absolutely essential that we really do need to consolidate the entire kind of life cycle of these campaigns into one hub. So with that said, I'm going to bounce back and start to answer questions. I know there is one here in the chat, but anybody else who has any questions or comments, please do toss it in there. We'll start to go through all of them. So the question that came in, does all the data we just looked at get stored in a larger file or only in the applicant's file? So if only in the applicant's file, does allow one to pull data from all applicants into one document? So that's a great question. So with Reviewer specifically, you own the data. So because of that, you have to have multiple ways of accessing it. Nothing should be held back from you. So the general premise here is that we want this to be a very interactive experience where you and your review teams are accessing people, right? They're real people, not just spreadsheets and rows. Viewing their profiles, viewing the content, viewing the deliverables. With that said, you can export them, download them. You can kind of consolidate them into one kind of long, view. We also have a really cool export into a folder structure. So again, just because I want to sit here and modernize as much as I can, I'm not naive that a lot of these campaigns still have a very physical manual nature to them, especially as their final selections. You might have committees that want to physically review content together. So what's going to happen is you could literally get a folder per applicant. Again, this is a download. And then within their folder is a PDF of their submission form, as well as all their supporting documents. And again, that can all be merged together. So there's many, many ways of accessing content deliverables, not just, on a per profile basis, but also kind of collectively together. With that said, there's also some real value in comparative analysis. And so being able to compare two profiles to one another, not necessarily a scorecard. With that said, I am of a firm belief that you have you're reviewing these grant applications with some type of subjective score sheet, right? You should be evaluating them on those metrics. But then as you narrow down like the top 10 or the top 5, or as you do your final selection, maybe that's where you take the data and say, okay, we did the best we could with score sheets. Now let's compare people to people, right? And have people have real subjective conversations around them. And that's also why having kind of like a larger, way of viewing the files together is helpful. The question that came in is, does it make sense to use it for grants and scholarships? On average, this is a really funny metric. Most of our clients use us for 3.3 use cases. So awards, grants, scholarships, fellowships, board nominations, recognition awards, conference abstracts, peer review, scientific papers. So we're used all over the place. At the end of the day, a scholarship and a grant application are the same. The content being collected, how you do the judging and selection process, and then the ongoing data needs are going to be different. But the three core consistencies are still the same. You've got an applicant applying for something, a grant or a scholarship. You have to operationally manage it, right? You have to view the content, assign it to your team, communicate, run reports, right? And then there has to be a review and selection process. And so, yeah, there are some very unique and dedicated components that will be different for them, but we have obviously all of those in place. So from a reporting perspective, again, this really kind of comes down to the fact that like you own the data. And so a lot of our implementation onboarding processes actually start with what your reporting needs are, because that very much influences kind of not just how the platform is set up, but also like just ensuring that we are collecting the data in a way that we can go back and report on in the future. So in your example, like can you report back on the actual funding type? So grant or scholarship. There's many ways to configure that, buckets, different platforms, like different portals within the system. But everything is done through a series of labels and tags. And so it allows you to kind of bifurcate your data into subsets and run reports on virtually anything. If the reports don't already exist in a reviewer, we have a really robust reporting tool called QuickSight. It's an Amazon Web Service tool. And basically what that means is that as long as we have the data in reviewer, we can create kind of these reports and these dashboards for you to access it in whatever manner you need. End it here. Again, I really appreciate your time today. Keep an eye out for those follow-ups. And as always, if there's anything I can ever do for you, please never hesitate. Thanks so much.